Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Water Solutions for Our Warming World. This afternoon, our topic is the realities of adaptation in the water sector. We have an array of experts on this topic who will be sharing their perspectives with you this afternoon, and we really appreciate your joining us. On behalf of the Arizona Institutes for Resilience, the Office for Research, Innovation, and Impact at the University of Arizona, and our co-sponsors, the Water Resources Research Center and the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy, I'd like to thank you all for joining this afternoon. My name is Kathy Jacobs, and I'm the director of the Center for Climate Adaptation Science and Solutions, which is one of 11 programs and projects within the Arizona Institutes for Resilience. We welcome you here today to join us in this conversation about water. We're really trying to increase our capacity to be engaged with the community and work on solutions that help with climate change issues. So I'm going to now welcome we expect about 200 of you to this conversation today. And note that this series is dedicated to our former colleague, Jim Shuttleworth, a Regents professor who worked at the University of Arizona for several decades and was responsible for playing a major role in understanding the role of the water cycle in climate change. He passed away this last December. There's more about his life and his family and a video about his contributions in the chat. I'm going to provide a little background now on the topic of climate change, water, and adaptation. It's just 2 slides. So it won't be a very long background, but I did want to share just a couple of points with you before I turn over this session to our moderator. First of all, in many ways, climate change is driving the water cycle, but the water cycle also drives climate change. So the intersection of the two is a pretty important thing to understand. The energy balance of the Earth is changing because of increased greenhouse heat trapping gases. Those gases warm the planet. And of course, that amplifies climate change in part because of increased water vapor in the atmosphere. So when you have more water vapor in the atmosphere, it actually changes the hydrologic cycle. It increases the intensity of precipitation. And changes a number of features that have to do with how the climate cycle works. So water really is an integral to the impacts of climate change, but it's also driving climate change in many ways. And then the other thing I just wanted to clarify, because I think it's very confusing for people sometimes, and that is the distinction between adaptation and mitigation. Those of us who work on climate issues focus on climate adaptation as a response to global warming, and adaptation actions limit risk or take advantage of opportunities. On the other hand, climate mitigation means reducing climate change, which requires a reduction in the flow of heat trapping gases into the atmosphere. We can do that either by limiting emissions in the first place, or by creating sinks that store the gases that have been emitted. So you can actually take gases out of the atmosphere, and that is called carbon sequestration. I just wanted to clarify that difference because many people get these terms confused. I think we'll go to next, and I am going to introduce Andrea Gerlach now. Andrea is the moderator for tonight's session. She's a professor in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment, and is the interim director of the Udall Center for Public Policy. She's also an amazing colleague and a huge pleasure to work with. I will now turn it over to you, Andrea. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kathy. Thank you. Well, it's a real honor to be here today. The intention with this webinar, with this session, is to really explore challenges related to adaptation around water, but also to really push beyond the challenges and to start to think about, to coalesce around solutions and to think about pathways forward. And this webinar reflects the University of Arizona's commitment to research and work around adaptation and also around water resources. And it aligns well with the mission of the units that are sponsoring this event, the Udall Center, for which I'm associated, but also the Water Resources Research Center and the director, Sharon Megdal. Sharon, thanks for being here. And of course, Kathy Seacass. There are two parts to our webinar today. The first part is a keynote address that'll really help set the stage about challenges and potential pathways forward with water and adaptation. And then the second part of our webinar is a roundtable discussion of experts that we've pulled together who work in this space. As Kathy indicated, we encourage you to put questions in the Q&A after the keynote address, and then after the roundtable discussion, we'll go through the Q&A and pose some questions to the panelists. So if they come up to you, if questions arise along the way, please do put them in the Q&A, and we'll follow up towards the end of today's webinar. Well, let's begin with our keynote address. It's a great honor for me to introduce Lester Snow. Among other distinguished positions that Lester has held, he's the former regional director for the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, former director of the California Department of Water Resources, and former secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency. He has helped design and orchestrate countless water resource management projects, and he's been involved in water issues across several Western states. It's a real honor to have you here, and I'll turn it over to you, Lester.
Thank you, Andrea. And notice the emphasis on former. I formerly had hair also, but she left that out. You know, when I was asked to do a kind of a 10-minute quick summary of adaptation and approaches to it, I thought that's easy enough. And then the closer I got to the date, and I started to think, well, I've got to talk about this, I've got to talk about that. However, I have boiled it down to about 3 hours and 23 minutes, so bear with me. And I'm not even going to mention the importance of alpine meadow restoration and the impact on water supply, flood management, fire, and ecosystem health, or dwell on setback levees and how the expansion of the floodplain it deals effectively with flood uncertainty and is essential to habitat restoration and preserving groundwater recharge. So I won't even do those since I already did it. You know, I think part of what I want to do, and maybe what's expected, is to kind of provoke a little bit of thought here. And I want to start with what I consider to be my standard pitch for a decade or more now. And that is that our natural resource system is changing faster than our institutions and policies are able to keep up or able to adapt. And in my opinion, we're actually falling behind. I've had too many conversations with people that kind of think adaptation is something in the future. Climate change, yeah, I guess it's real, and we're going to have to adapt to it, but it's been going on for decades. It's in our face now, and we need to move more quickly. And in my opinion, we need different institutional structures and different authorities in order to do that effectively. And I'll just stipulate the water sector for me includes flood management, ecosystem health, watershed health, and water supply reliability. The impacts are accelerating. It's not like we've been so effective in greenhouse gas reduction that we can take our time. It's actually accelerating. And the problem is our natural resource management system is very highly fragmented. And when anything's fragmented, it's very slow to respond. While we've seen many changes, and I think we'll probably discuss today some what I might call heroic efforts of getting out in front of this, we're still managing through the lens of authorizing legislation and institutions created in the 50s, 60s, and 70s when we didn't talk about rapid climate change. And I think that has to change as we move forward. Institutional silos need to be breached. or at least made porous. So we're working with multi-benefits and multi-objective kinds of approaches. And we need to be systematic in the way that we pursue adaptation. And what I mean by that, you can't pick one jurisdiction in the middle of a watershed and they've got some great programs and good enough. You really need to take a look at a region or at watershed scale in order to implement strategies that address all of the different impacts. So, a little bit of a pet peeve. In the early 2000s, and you wanted to talk about adaptation, and the mitigation crowd just didn't want to talk about it. It was almost like admitting defeat. We need to focus on greenhouse gas reduction. I agree with that completely, but I think we ended up being the little sibling following around the big brother and waiting for scraps at times. And that just has to change. And we call it adaptation, but really what we're doing is mitigating the impacts of climate change. That word's been taken, so we'll stick with adaptation. But we have to change the way that we look at it. We simply cannot continue to look at it as a bunch of one-offs that sort of fit together. Adaptation isn't sexy. It's really hard because of the fragmentation issue and the need to look at resources in an integrated fashion. This may irritate some greenhouse gas folks, but it's easier. We know what the greenhouse gases are. We can actually monitor them. We can test them in the atmosphere. We tend to have better mechanisms, EPA, California EPA, the Air Resources Board, to decide this is where we have to go, and these are the steps and how we're going to limit greenhouse gas emissions to achieve our objective. There's no parallel in terms of adaptation. It really varies watershed to watershed. What will be the most effective action? How do you monitor it? How do you measure it? I mean, so it's much more challenging, but it would be a stoic victory to achieve, net zero in 2050, which is a very idealistic goal, but ignore the impacts that are going to occur between now and 2050 and after as the system rebalances. We're much less resilient today than we were, say, 30 years ago. We have these compounding impacts of high temperature, higher evapotranspiration, more toxic algae in the water system. So there's just a lot of issues that we have to deal with. So as I've already mentioned, siloed actions are necessary. They're just not sufficient in terms of really dealing with the issues. Serial permitting, I'm going to kind of pull that out as something that has to be dealt with. And it's, a project that I think I got started at DWR, or maybe just prior to DWR, a tidal wetlands project, 20 years to make it functional. Because of changes in administrations, the sheer number of state, federal, and local permits that were necessary, funding that was reallocated because the project wasn't making enough progress. And those are the kinds of things we have to have a different system for doing that. Absolutely no question about that. So a couple points I want to make here. One, California, in some places, it looks like we're headed to a record shortage, kind of on the scale of the 1976-77 drought. And one of the things that's come up, I kind of share here, I mean, drought is becoming an old-fashioned term. LA Times had a nice op-ed kind of raising the issue, but the way we've used drought in the past is really an indicator of water storage and people's ability to divert water. So how much water people are getting for farms or for consumption, and what's going on in their reservoirs. And so, for example, in 2017, when then Governor Brown declared the drought over, reservoirs were full, good snowpack, good runoff, high allocations to people. That didn't deal with the soil moisture profile in a watershed that had not remotely recovered from being at historic levels. Did not deal at all with groundwater basin refill or the health of the ecosystem that suffered from low water and high temperatures. And so drought isn't really a good way of explaining kind of what happens in the water system. I'll mention, you notice Governor Newsom in the, well, that's Lake Mendocino, and there's a duck there. And I guess I just became a photo op for the photographer that was there. But, you know, there's a recall, and the guy that's running against him, John Cox, is touring the state with a 1,000-pound brown bear as part of getting attention. So I presume this is Governor Newsom's way of saying my duck can beat your bear. I'm not sure. The pattern that we have with climate change is high temperatures, higher ET in the forests and wildlands, much higher winds. Often we've been experiencing late season rain that all it does is build tinder, and we get this, and already into fire season here in California. Climate change doesn't cause fire. It's like the old BASF ad, you know, a giant chemical company in Germany. Their ad was, "We don't make things, we make things better," and that's climate change. They don't cause these events, but they make them far worse. I wanted to, you know, I didn't mention on the last one the whole land use issue, but it kind of comes up here also. So you have the fire, you have drought, and you have here the cumulative impact. So the two top photos show what happens when you have protracted drought, loss of watershed soil moisture, intense fire, intense rain, in a fresh burned area, and you have mudslide and debris flows that we didn't used to deal with. And this is happening more and more in urban areas. On the left, that happens to be Highway 101. Actually, there's another photo I didn't include where the mud flow went right by Oprah's house. I suspect the flood folks will get great attention to that part of the river system. So, how do we move forward? We need streamlined and consolidated permitting. And I'll just relay one quick story on permitting. In 2007, we had some pretty significant flooding in California and major threats of levee system failure. And some did fail, we had a lot of firefight. But the worst thing happened when the floodwaters receded and many of the levees had suffered damage that actually probably the levee should have failed. But the problem was you need to fix those levees prior to the next flood season. And actually convened all of the permitters that sat in a room and processed all the permits for the repair project simultaneously. And we were able to take care of the worst sites, get by the next flood season, which was not a bad flood year. As soon as that happened, the process disappeared and we returned to sequential processing of permits. We need better incentives for comprehensive regional strategies for adaptive management. In my opinion, we need to build strong business coalitions to move forward on adaptive management. This is even more true now, given the state of politics in DC. We need insurance CEOs and others saying, get on with this and provide us some protection. Nimble coalitions between academia and certainly multidisciplinary teams to help local managers, local government, resource managers, databases so we better understand what the avoided costs could be. We need to consider dealing with some kind of sacred cows, all laws that are over 50 years old. And can we streamline those to help us move forward more quickly? And the consideration of better governance structures. Seeing that I'm pretty much over time, let me just mention very quickly on governance structures. There are attempts, we've seen compacts used. There's some thought. One of the problems you have in coordination is you have a change in our case, a governor or a president is up for election every 2 years. And so you never know when you're going to get a shift in commitment. And so there's some thought of using compacts, and specifically compacts that include Indian tribes, because they're sovereign nations. And perhaps you can wrest away some of the kind of federal holding on to their regulatory authorities in such situations. However, to be clear, our Congress probably isn't in the mood to deal with issues like that at this point. So I'll cut it short now that I've run over by a considerable amount of time. I apologize to the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lester. Thanks for setting the stage for our conversation today. And now we want to move into our roundtable discussion. Joining Lester, we have 4 additional participants who are experts working in this water and adaptation space. And I've asked our roundtable participants to briefly introduce themselves and say a word or two about how they've been working on adaptation around water. I'd like to begin by welcoming Governor Stephen Lewis from the Gila River Indian community. Please introduce yourself, Governor Lewis, and welcome.
Good, Tosh. Anya Anaptuga, Governor Stephen Rowe Lewis, the Gila River Indian community. It's an honor to be here. It was a great keynote as well. And, you know, as the governor of the Gila River Indian community, you know, just between Tucson and Phoenix, you know, we are 2 distinct peoples, the Aquifer, as well as the Pipash, who migrated over 100 years ago from the Colorado River. We created this Gila River Indian community. As you know, we had a historic fight for our water. And over 150 years ago, our water was, in a word, stolen from us. And so the Gila River Indian community, we call it the Kuriakamo, was our lifeblood. That, in fact, you know, that is where we derive our historic identity from and our survival. So looking right now, moving forward, we are in a continuation of this connection, this ancestral connection to water. You know, we've always prided ourselves on being stewards and caretakers of our natural resources. So a lot of these issues are just very critical, you know, for the community. You know, we look at things both locally, but also regionally as well. Locally, when we talk about, and I know the keynote touched on just how long it took, 20 years to develop wetlands. For the community, we developed this once we had the opportunity to develop a working aquifer, which we call the MAR 5. And we turned this into an interpretive trail to teach our community members, our young children, about our ongoing connection. That was the goal and the vision of my father, the late Rod Lewis, who was our water attorney, dedicated his life to the profession of defending water rights for Native Americans and for our community. And then at the regional level, you know, we played a key role in bringing together stakeholders, working with the federal agencies, state agencies, local governments, in regards to the Arizona's drought contingency plan. And so, you know, because of our water settlement and the significant amount of water that we regained, we were able to play a key role in this. And importantly, for the first time, tribes like the Gila River Indian community were key leaders sitting at the table. And that basin guidelines reconsultation process is starting again. So this is another opportunity for a basin-wide conversation about how to develop to less water being available in the direct connection to climate change. So, tribes, we have an opportunity to move very quickly and to bring very innovative solutions to water management issues because we are sovereign nations, because of the authority and the jurisdiction that we have both, within our businesses and within our tribal governments. And so, I think we have opportunities to really go beyond what was called that siloed approach and to really bring innovative solutions. And for the Gila River Indian community, we're proud to really, I think, lead the way and have some great models to show not only all other Indian tribes, but also to be a model for cutting edge, very progressive, but also grounded in our culture and our tradition, water management policies and practices.
Thanks, Governor Lewis. We're looking forward to hearing more about what you've been doing and what you've been working on. Now I'm honored to welcome Dr. Jeff Arnold with the Army Corps of Engineers.
Thanks very much, Andrea, and thanks for inviting us to this great panel. I'm Jeff Arnold. I'm the lead climate scientist for the Army Engineers and run the National Responses to Climate Change program. And in that program, we try to look at two different kinds of things. We're directed at climate adaptation. Lester made very useful distinction between adaptation and mitigation. And most of what we're doing is looking at climate adaptation, but I also work to bridge the gap between adaptation and mitigation so that we don't make choices and move out on paths in one or another of these two areas that will preclude future choices in the other path. One of the things we're trying to do is develop not only the science. My work is actually in atmospheric science, and I came to the Corps 10 years ago to work on moving atmospheric science closer to the hydrologic science that the Corps' traditional support and expertise has been, to try to push atmospheric science closer to that so we can build new ways to answer questions about climate change so that the Corps can continue to help its partners and meet the problems of water and energy security for the future. One of the things we want to do is make sure that when we build these answers that we can also communicate them effectively to our partners and our stakeholders and the rest of the climate change hydrology community. The climate scientists are now famously known not to have been doing such a good job on communicating what it is that we knew about climate change for a long time. We've gotten much better in the last 5 years, I'd say, and a lot of that is due to a generational change, so that as new people come through training programs and take over, they want very much to have their work used publicly, and we're trying to harness some of that interest and move out a lot of our information so that people like the people who are attending this panel and listening to this series, very useful series from the University of Arizona, will have access to that information.
Thanks, Jeff. We're so pleased to have you with us. I'd now like to welcome Colby Pellegrino. Colby is with the Las Vegas Valley Water District and the Southern Nevada Water Authority.
Hi, thank you, Andrea. I'm Colby Pellegrino, and I'm the Deputy General Manager for Resources at the Southern Nevada Water Authority and Las Vegas Valley Water District. So in a nutshell, I'm responsible for the water resource planning to meet the future needs of our community of about 2.3 million people a year in Southern Nevada. Included within those responsibilities is our climate change strategies and our water conservation strategies. I'm really excited to join the conversation today, and maybe my only opening remark, to keep it brief, would be that I think the hardest part of adaptation is that it's not a one-time thing. There is no easy button in adaptation. And you're talking about continually changing people's behavior, which regardless of what scale of the water resource problems you're working on, doing something once is easy. Getting people to do it over again is very hard. So thank you for having me here.
Thanks, Colby. Thanks so much. And finally, Emily Wasley with the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you, Andrea. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel today. Thank you, Lester, for your opening remarks. So I serve as the Corporate Climate Risk Adaptation and Resilience Practice Lead for WSP USA. WSP USA is one of the world's leading engineering and infrastructure professional services firm. I'm based out of Oakland, California on the Ohlone tribal land. And as Andrea mentioned, I also serve as president of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals, otherwise known as ASAP. So during my day job, I work with publicly traded, privately held Fortune 50 to Fortune 500 companies, really better understanding and identifying and addressing their climate-related risks and maximizing the opportunities to develop new products, services, and partnerships around sustainability and resilience. I do a lot of work in relation to ESG strategy and implementation with a keen focus on the task force and climate-related financial disclosures. So I work with a variety of different sectors, one of which I'll mention is the IT sector. And they have a lot of data centers around the world, and data centers use water for cooling. So I've been working very closely with these clients to better understand the water stress in their regions and the host communities, to actually fund water replenishment projects, to enhance the adaptive capacity of the management measures on the ground for water management and more effective water management, and then also collaborating with the water utilities to enhance their resilience and collaboration writ large. I also just recently wrapped up a 3-year-long project with Kathy Jacobs with a variety of different water utilities, and what we did was we helped them co-design a framework to map climate-related risks and opportunities to their mission-critical business functions. And so that provided us an opportunity to really understand some aha moments for adaptation solutions, for cross-collaboration, and some much-needed and much more efficient collaboration and coordination across the water utilities.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily. We're interested in hearing and excited to learn more about your work. I want to ask all of the roundtable panelists to turn their cameras back on. Thank you so much. And Lester, welcome back. Welcome to our panel. Thank you. Okay, well, Lester got us really started here. He outlined some challenges and some urgency to the work that needs to be done. And I thought we could start our conversation. Maybe we'll start in a little more positive place. And I'd love to hear from a few of you about what you've seen working on the ground, like what's working, what's helping us move the needle forward to promote adaptation around water. Where are you seeing kind of the sweet spots? Or things really coalescing and moving along. I'd love to hear from Governor Lewis first. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, most tribes, as I sort of mentioned in my intro, most tribes have an advantage in adaptation at a local level because the governments, the tribal government and major businesses are owned by the tribal nation. And so it can tackle issues more holistically, less siloed. Now with that, an example again would be the community. We've adopted the Gila River Indian community, and we're home to over 23,000 tribal members. And so we've adopted a comprehensive water plan to ensure we can continue to have water to meet our on-reservation needs, even though climate change has increased the risk of shortage, and the cost of delivery of this water, of course, has increased. And an important part of this plan, and this was, I am an elected leader with 17-member council, and so this was really a historic plan that we worked on with our water experts, our attorneys, our hydrologists, to really come up with this very important plan for our community. And this important part of this plan is the development of a managed aquifer recharge project. That was an important example of this plan. And as you know, that recharges our aquifers so we can sustainably rely on our underground water to protect and to preserve our underground water supply during future shortages And so this allows us to adapt to climate change. And eventually we would like to recharge 60 to 70,000 acre feet per year. And these MARS, managed aquifer recharge, are also have been an opportunity to develop our wetlands, our riparian restoration, which is actually one of my legacy goals, was to bring back the flow of the Gila River in those appropriate areas. And this is very culturally important to our community, that we maintain this historic goal, which is maintaining this connection to water, or to the Gila River. And this was, as my late father, who fought for our water rights, this was his vision, that he saw the MAR, which is developing the wetlands, a working aquifer, but also an interpretive site and a place for our community members to go and to be able to use that site for our historic basket making, for a lot of our historic cultural and spiritual activities. So it was all found at the Gila River. And so, so this was, as my father saw this, was a living tribute to our ongoing connection to the Gila River. Now, on the regional level, I think things get more complex because you have more stakeholders, more federal agencies, state agencies, local governments, and tribes, with a particular point of view. And sometimes, as you know, they don't all intersect, or maybe sometimes they collide. But I think recently, during the drought contingency plan, the discussions, we saw a lot of cooperation among these different groups to address the shortages in the near term. And again, the Gila River community, because of our water settlement, the water that we oversee and control, we were able to play a very instrumental role in the drought contingency plan for Arizona. And importantly, for the first time, again, tribes were key leaders. We brought actually very innovative plans, working across, with the ag community, with the developers, with the state of Arizona, with our quasi-governmental entity, of course, the CAP as well. And so working really to be able to bring, this diverse group of stakeholders together was historic. And so I think we have, moving forward, I think we have an opportunity now to really even address some of these very innovative, high level, I think, opportunities that our keynote speaker, Mr. Snow, eloquently put out. Because, for me as a Native American, whether I'm a leader or not, we have the first Native American who is the Secretary of Interior, Madam Secretary Deb Haaland, who knows as a Pueblo Native woman, she knows instinctively, she knows, and she has a priority, the protection of natural resources. So she has that as her top priority. So I think not just tribes, but I think all stakeholders are going to look to her leadership, and dare I say visionary leadership, that she is taking the Department of Interior in, and of course the Bureau of Reclamation. That is one of those key agencies that oversees the federal water trust resource, especially as it connects to tribes as sovereign nations. So we see this as a very critical, but also very exciting and historic time that we're in moving forward. When we talk about getting through this pandemic, of course, Native Americans, we were hit the hardest during this pandemic, both with positive cases and sadly, with fatalities as well. So you see this lack of infrastructure from the federal government. Tribes, you look at one of the largest tribes, not only in the United States, but in Arizona, the Navajo Nation didn't have running water. So issues of equity, issues, when we talk about the federal government's role, and also that historic underinvestment in infrastructure, and specifically with tribal nations. I think those are very pertinent, very important points that also need to be made within the context of this discussion moving forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Governor Lewis. Let's travel a little west to Southern Nevada and hear from Colby. Colby, what do you see working on the ground to help promote and foster adaptation around water?
I think that I'm going to go with two themes that kind of more broadly apply than just locally. And I think the first is building shared understanding of risk, and that we see that work particularly well here through our citizens advisory committees, where we pull cross sections of the community and kind of give them the deep dive. But we've seen lots of examples on the river, some of which Governor Lewis touched on, but things like the Arizona Reconsultation Committee and the work that they did in Arizona to get to DCP, the Water and Tribes Initiative, and these other areas that kind of bring a broader stakeholder group together to build that shared understanding of what the risk is that we need to adapt towards. And for the most part, all of those that I've been in have been at least somewhat successful in causing actions to change. I think the other one that I would put out there, which is a which is a little bit of a no-brainer, is incentives. And having incentive programs to adapt or to change behavior, probably more appropriately, our work. We are wildly successful in Southern Nevada with implementing conservation through incentive-based programs. But the Colorado River as a whole has been successful through kind of the carrots and sticks approaches of getting flexibility related to water storage or things like that in exchange for using less water on the long term. The problem with both of those, which is probably a later question, is durability and funding. But I think those two things, if I were to go at the highest level of success, are making sure people understand shared risk and having incentives to help people adapt to it.
Great, thanks, Colby. Well, Emily, you have broad experience working with lots of different kinds of actors and companies. You mentioned IT companies in your intro. We'd love to hear some of your thoughts around what you see really working on the ground.
Well, and I think I'll build off of what Colby just mentioned, is that shared understanding of climate-related risks, water stress. And, you know, it's so interesting working with massive companies that are global. And there is a disconnect between the companies and the communities. And so trying to work to share those resources, share the understanding of the risk assessment approach, the methodology, the science, the data that's available to really enhance that shared understanding, and then identify areas of collaboration and ways to move forward collectively. And so through the work that I've been working with on the business side, it's really been interesting to work with the IT and software industry and better understand how they're, one, understanding their risks, and then setting targets and really being more proactive about reaching out to partners on the ground to who know and are trusted agents within those communities to better understand what the needs are around water resource management, around adaptive capacity, around water replenishment, what have you. And so I think more of that is needed, but I think that the business community and the host communities are starting to have that kind of interaction. On the water utility side, I think it's looking across and mainstreaming really the risks and identifying the risks across critical business functions. So for example, we worked with a variety of different water utilities, two of which were San Francisco Public Utility Commission and then Denver Water. And they brought to the table 3 different business functions that don't traditionally think about climate change on a day-to-day basis. For example, we had business services, health and safety, watershed management, finance and risk management. And so coming together at a shared table really helped them better understand, one, what their underlying vulnerabilities are without climate change, And then you layer on climate change and things get worse. And so collectively, they were able to identify solutions that are really starting to actually unfold as we speak, to address these risks. And some of which include, incorporating a climate warming question into their internal business case questionnaire for a new capital project, or integrating climate change into their integrated resource planning scenario approach. So it's things like this in terms of like understanding the risks and then collectively identifying solutions that also address the co-benefits of both climate mitigation and climate adaptation, and equity is key. So those are some examples of how we're seeing these areas kind of come abroad.
Perfect. Thanks. Thanks to the three of you for sharing some of your insights and your experiences. I wonder, is water-related adaptation different from other resources? Is there something unique about water? And I'd love to turn to you, Jeff, for some of your insights working with the Corps on this.
Yeah, I think one of the key things is that makes it a little different is that while we're trying to work on adaptation in the water sector, water is a key element of the climate system itself. And so while we're working on it, we're working on something that is going into, is both, as Lester said at the outset, that there's this interaction, or maybe this was Kathy added, there's an interaction between climate and water in ways that may not be as obvious for other units of the economy and other sectors, so that it requires us to potentially have more information about setting out to understand how to both characterize our risk and then reduce that risk through adaptation actions, because it's part of the actual climate system. So and the reason we might want to characterize it a little more carefully is because we don't want to do something and have unintended consequences. So we're going to start making these adaptation actions. And as Colby emphasized again, that the important thing about adaptation is to get started. And then the next important thing is to keep going, because a single action does not make all of your adaptation dreams come true. And for water, I think it can be difficult to try to characterize what those actions should be, since they're so tightly correlated with elements of the entire Earth system and are affecting climate. So I was particularly struck by the way Colby and then Emily emphasized this shared understanding of risk and help bring people together. I think what's important there too, and the reason that we may be having more success in that for the last 4 or 5 years, is because we're at a point where a lot of our information now can be the basis for sharing that characterization of risk, so that people can agree on information about climate change, and they can agree on things. We know more about how much water is being used in sectors of the economy, and what the damage of non-reusable use of that water is. And we can characterize numerically and run experiments. We can characterize how that use can change over time and still deliver on the things that we're supposed to be able to deliver on for our communities, and yet potentially use less water in those cases. So I think that the continued refinement of information around the questions that people have, the specific kinds of questions that people have, can help us really build out this shared conception of risk.
Thanks so much, Jeff. So if we then view water as part of the climate system, and it then makes it more complicated, more challenging to identify the actions, doesn't that kind of make it harder for us to start to identify or think about the kinds of institutional change or the policy change that we need to move on, that we need to have to kind of move us into this adaptation space? I mean, you set the stage for this, Lester, with your keynote. I wonder if some of the panelists, Lester, would you like to say a little bit more about of the kinds of institutions and the policies, given this complexity around adaptation and water? What do we need? Sure.
I think a lot of the attention is on how you go to scale. I mean, there are a lot of good things going on, but how do you take them to a watershed scale? And we don't have a lot of good mechanisms for that. And yet we know that's the way that we need to go about it. So can't remember who brought up incentives, but for years in California, have tried to use financial incentives from bond money to put out into what we call integrated regional water management plans. Those were marginally successful, but there's a lot more interest in that now. But I think, I'm real high on private sector engagement in these issues. We can't keep it in the government silos. And what I've found, and I think both Emily and Colby kind of mentioned this, don't go in talking about the existential threat of greenhouse gas emissions and what it's going to do. Start talking about risk and risk avoidance. And that's a language that they understand and you can move very quickly. And I think they can be advocates in helping to break down the silos and go to a much more of a regional watershed scale. Anything that we want to do is happening somewhere, but it's happening in a small jurisdiction. I mean, we have tribes that are leading the way. People are now starting to pay attention to tribal ecological knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge. And hopefully the Forest Service follows suit and does controlled burns, and that affects water runoff. And so the system's all there, but it's the speed and the scale to move more quickly.
Great, thanks. Colby, I wonder if you have some thoughts on this around the kinds of institutions we need, the changes we need within those institutions, the new kinds of policies. You said a bit about incentives. I'd love to hear further thoughts.
To dumb it down, durable ones. A lot of, I think what I see getting in the way of some of the more nationally focused stuff is they're changing constantly. Which makes it really hard for people to figure out what they are and how to utilize them. And some of that change is good. Like we're seeing a ton of money come into state revolving funds right now through the Clean Water Act to help adapt to some of what's going to happen to water quality. But kind of the constant movement of funding sources and which funds do I go after and which grants am I eligible for, even for the very astute water agencies are hard to keep track of. And I feel like we do a disservice in some ways to smaller water agencies because they don't have the staff to keep up to date on everything that's happening nationally and through federal programs that really could benefit them. So I think durability is really important. In terms of institutions and policies that are necessary. I think the other thing that we kind of have to do is figure out a way to bring everyone into the discussion from all sectors. And it kind of ties into the question you had about how water is different. And I would say that's prior appropriation. Water is different because of prior appropriation. And particularly in the West, where senior water right holders don't have as much of an incentive to be a part of the solution. And on any metric you want to look at the Colorado River on, every sector has to participate or we cannot withstand drought. So coming up with the institutions and policies and programs that, again, underscore that shared risk and are able to look at it across the entire basin and figure out how to adapt. And I'll give a positive example there, which is the Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program. There's still more that needs to be done there. We know that, but that program started 20 years ago with the 50-year look at let's try and come up with all of the compliance that we might need for how we're going to impact species over the next 50 years instead of for one project. And that's allowed us to continue to improve the habitat for listed species in the lower basin, regardless of what the individual drivers are or the people that are seeking compliance that have to put money in that time. So again, it's created a really durable way to deal with endangered species. And it's because it's durable. It's because it was meant to be 50 years long. So looking at things that are durable, I think is really important.
Great, thank you so much. Well, let's talk about who hasn't been part of the conversation. How do we engage who hasn't been there, and how do we engage a fuller set of actors around adaptation and water? Emily, you mentioned one of your set of comments here, some question about equity. So I'd love for you to get us started, and who hasn't been part of these conversations and who do we need to be engaging more fully?
Yeah, I mean, I think the equity piece has not yet been fully realized. And I think the impacts have been starting to be shown in terms of impacts to communities that are hit first and worst by climate change, but also have not as good access to clean or affordable water. So I think, you know, some of the discussions that came up through a tabletop exercise that we held with Denver Water and San Francisco Public Utility Commission was the fact that, you know, with climate migration and, you know, different customer needs, how do we equitably transition to a more, you know, to a warming climate with this dwindling resource of water availability? And so I think, you know, the NGOs on the ground, the trusted partners within the communities, I know have been, you know, engaging with some water utilities, but I think more of that needs to happen. I think, you know, listening to and recognizing the hurt that has happened in these communities, and then collectively coming together to identify equitable solutions is really, really important. And that's one area that with a lot of the companies that I work with, I'm trying to get them outside of their boundaries and their walls to think about the host communities and to really engage in meaningful conversations and listening more to the needs of the folks that are on the ground in the communities that may not have been using as much water as they have been, and now there is less to go around. So I don't know if that answers the question entirely, but I would love to hear others from the panel's thoughts on equity and how we can better incorporate that and embed that across water management and climate adaptation.
Thanks so much, Emily. Governor Lewis, I'd love to turn it over to you. You mentioned earlier the role of the Gila River Indian community with the drought contingency plan. You also mentioned the new renegotiations coming up. I'd love to hear your thoughts about who hasn't been at the table and how best to do that moving forward.
Right. Thank you. As a tribal leader, you know, I have a key perspective on this in regards to seeing that tribal nations until recent times have not been part of the solution or the discussion. And it's important to have all partners at the table, as I said earlier, since tribal nations have a depth of knowledge about the natural world. You know, our indigenous knowledge, I know was referred to earlier in the discussion. And that can be employed very effectively to ensure a holistic approach to climate change and adaptation is utilized in that respect. Some tribes like the Gila River Indian community, you know, we have a significant amount of water and a lot of risk associated with that water, and really need to be part of these conversations because, you know, in certain respects, we have the most to lose in these reconsultations. You know, when policy is made, and you know, historically, you have the state and the federal partners negotiating for us, and without us being at the table historically. So involving tribes early on in this discussion is key because we are sovereign nations, and I think you see that played out in the past and currently now. In the Arizona and the Colorado River guidelines reconsultations. You know, the state of Arizona has made it a priority to meaningfully involve tribes. And I really commend Governor Ducey of Arizona and the Arizona Department of Water Resources Director, Tom Bushotsky, for their leadership in involving tribes early on in this process. But, you know, I testified earlier this morning in the U.S. House the Ways and Means in regards to infrastructure. And I was the only tribal person testifying, tribal leader. There are these issues when we're talking about any infrastructure legislation that's occurring right now. And so this discussion of equity, of our infrastructure and how it's been affected, whether it's water infrastructure or other types of infrastructure, affordable housing, the discussion is put into the context of how this is all being affected by climate change, and what is the path forward? How do we look at a sustainable path forward? And so this is a very relevant discussion that we're having, and hopefully, some of these opportunities and associated with risk, associated, with some holistic examples, can somehow be incorporated into what's happening now in regards to where this nation is going policy-wise, in regards to the critical infrastructure need and the federal resources that are needed to be invested, and to make sure that underserved communities of color, tribal nations, especially historically, since there is a trust relationship between the federal government and tribes, that we don't get left behind, that we don't fall through the cracks. So this is all very relevant discussion, both what's happening now in DC with our lawmakers, but also what's happening within our own subject matter expertise.
Great, thank you so much. I'd love to open it up now for some Q&A. We've had some questions coming in through the Q&A function. If you have questions, please drop them in there and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. One of the first questions that I see there is a big one. So we'll see who wants to answer this. But the question is, what's the role of agriculture in adaptation? And it's not something that really any of you have addressed here today. Does anyone want to jump in and say something about the role of agriculture, certainly in the Colorado River Basin, but even just more broadly?
I'm happy to go first. But Dr. Flessa is correct. A large portion of the basin is in agriculture, and it doesn't take complicated models to understand that agriculture has to be as part of the solution. We have if you take the reductions that occur under the deepest level of drought contingency planning, we have over 12.5 million acre feet of use that will be occurring in the basin. And the average flow of the river for the last 21 years is about 12.7 million acre feet. And climate change projections are suggesting there's somewhere on the low end, 10.5 or 11 million acre feet that we need to be prepared for. So you have to find a way to cut another 1.5 million acre feet of use out in order to be sustainable. There isn't that much municipal use in the lower basin. There's a lot, but you could completely get rid of the cities and you can't solve the problem. So agriculture has to be a part of solution. And I go back to what I said earlier, which is water is different because of prior appropriation, and that incentive isn't there for agriculture. I think the other thing that's kind of hard when it comes to agriculture is the incentive programs that exist at the federal level are not designed for Western agriculture. They're designed for the breadbasket. That's where those programs are created. That's where the majority of the money is spent, and they don't necessarily translate well. So when we're using a program to create on-farm efficiency improvements that actually makes them consumptively use more water, that's not really a benefit of the basin. And that's because, again, those programs are constructed where water security isn't the primary focus of doing those types of programs. So it's a really complicated issue. And we started to get there through the system conservation program, which again was that incentivizing agriculture to do less. I think the ability for our institutions to pay consistently to have agriculture solve the problem will be pretty taxing. But I think they have to be a part of the solution for us to get through it. And that will be, I think, a really interesting part of the next round of negotiations.
Thank you. Any other panelists who'd like to take on this question?
Well, I share just a couple thoughts, more California focused than the Colorado River Basin. But, in 2014, we passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and most of the estimates show that in order to bring the groundwater basins in balance in the San Joaquin Valley, you're probably looking at 400,000 to 500,000 acres of ag land will come out of production. And the governor's budget introduced last Friday actually has a whole category that's called land repurposing. And it's got money to help assist that, with some of those farmers already looking at converting to solar farms and using their land for those purposes. The other issue that I know the Secretary for Agriculture here is looking at is that we have crops in the valley, tree crops that need, I think they're called chill days. They need X number of chill days in order to really produce a high level of fruit. And those are going to go away, that we won't hit those lower temperature days. So I think there's crop shifting, there's land retirement, and there's state-of-the-art conservation going on to try to adjust to the new reality. But broadly in California, there's great support for maintaining a healthy agricultural economy, which often is critical to disadvantaged communities in the valley.
Thanks. Any final remarks on this question before I move
Yeah,
on?
I'd just say quickly that one great thing about agriculture is that it's a terrific place where we can test out some ideas about the intersection between adaptation and mitigation, because of course agriculture is an enormous contributor to climate change directly. And so not just from beef production, but a lot from beef and other cattle production, but from all kinds of uses and sustainment of agriculture. So it would be terrific if we could shape some of the incentives that Colby and Lester talked about earlier as ways to draw in the private sector to work on combined types of approaches that could help on both sides of the climate change question. And if we could do something like that, then it's a thing that could help not only in the United States, but would be terrifically effective in places like the Global South, for example.
Thank you. I see another question that popped up, and it relates to the role of federal agencies, cooperation, but also leadership from federal agencies. Is it possible, and how might it be possible for U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. Department of Energy, or other federal agencies to work on solving water and energy issues, to work together and to provide leadership in this space? We have some federal and former federal officials, but also others who work with federal agencies. Anyone want to take a shot at this one?
Since nobody else is, I can say a couple of words, which is, it doesn't have to be the federal agencies that drive this conversation, because I think it's very different state to state. The Nevada state engineer has not permitted water to be used for thermoelectric power generation in quite a long time, particularly in Southern Nevada. And unlike the commenter in Nevada, the bulk of our water use is not related to thermoelectric power generation. But what's driving adaptation is our state requirement that energy providers have 50% renewable energy by 2050. And we are considered an energy provider because we provide our own load for some of our facilities. So in doing so, we're bringing on large scale solar ourselves to help adapt to that. So I don't necessarily know that it's a federal problem. I've been to tons of these energy water nexus things. And I feel about like we talk about energy over here and we talk about water over here, and there's solutions for both, but we never really look at the overlap. And again, I would go back to that if somebody has a senior water right, they don't really have an incentive to change. And so you have to find some way to bring them into the discussion other than just the basin has a bigger issue, or your water source has a bigger issue, or in this case, the globe has a bigger issue.
So to what extent can adaptive management or even systems thinking help us, bridge that or marriage those kind of different sectoral approaches that we've had? Are these strategies adaptive management or systems thinking? I know systems thinking is something you've thought a little bit about, Jeff. Adaptive management is something you've worked on, Lester. Do you guys have thoughts about those approaches or strategies?
Well, yeah, I mean, in the deepest sense, adaptation is adaptive management because you're going to have to do it, as we've said, you're going to have to do it more than once. And so you're going to, anytime you see any description of adaptation, if you go, for example, to the most recent National Climate Assessment, or even the one before that, if you look at the adaptation chapter, there will be a diagram in the shape of a cycle, and there will be stages around the ring of adaptation, and those will include acting and then learning from those actions, and then moving forward with change and management strategies. I think we can get a little bit misled if we think that there are adaptation strategies that we can adapt for climate change now and in the future that are built off of adaptive management strategies which have worked for climate variability that we've seen in the past. And I'll just say quickly, parenthetically, the distinction there is natural climate variability. Climate, when we say climate change, we mean human-driven climate change. And the reason it's important not to rely entirely on the adaptive management schemes that we've developed for variability is because one of the things we know is that the range of variability because of human-driven climate change is going to be much larger and much more variable than the range that we've seen in the past. So that simply taking that cycle diagram that's worked in some cases for the past for natural climate variability may not work in the future. So we have to continue to be able to observe. There's lots of work to plan out the kinds of adaptation actions we would take, and then to follow through by learning whether those are working and how we can adapt those in the future.
Yeah, if I could comment on a couple things, adaptive management. I mean, I think that's critical, and I think actually the inability to have adaptive management, not as a science project, but as a governance structure, it's actually an impediment to rapid implementation, because there's kind of this attitude of we've got to get this big strategy right. You know, we've got to get it right. It may take us 10 more model runs over 5 years to figure out what we're doing. The only thing I can guarantee is your model runs in 10 years will have been wrong, and you need to adjust. So there has to be an adaptive management process where you get to say, that's not working, here's what we're going to do now, and not have to go back and go through the entire process. That's queued up right now in a very sensitive process going on in the state over water and protecting the Delta. One of the problems is the regulatory agencies don't want to give up any authority. So they don't want to give it up to a panel of people that might say, stop doing that, it's not working for the fish, do this instead. And I think that's the key on adaptation, is just do it. And if it's not working, fix it. And we get caught in this, let's make sure we get it perfect. The other thing I would say, one of the things that gives me hope about mitigation or greenhouse gas reduction is the business community stepping in. Give the business community some certainty. Like in California, we're going to hit these targets. We're going to do away with internal combustion engines. And as a result, at least according to the governor's budget, there's 30 manufacturers of electric cars in California. I had no idea. And I just think we need to figure out how to frame some of these adaptation issues so it's of interest to the business community to step in and bring creativity.
Okay,
and to build on what Lester just
go ahead, please, Emily, go ahead.
Just mentioned in terms of the business community, I'm really hopeful with the Securities and Exchange Commission coming out with new guidelines and information about requirements or regulatory changes related to climate-related disclosure that will bring to the table the requirement for publicly traded companies and massive companies that are in the ag sector and that do take up a lot of water to disclose publicly their risks around climate change and water security. And so with that, I think there will be more opportunities that companies will start to maximize to really look at water efficiencies and ways to cool data centers without water, or just new products and services that use water more in a better manner, in a more efficient manner, and a more sustainable manner. And so I think there are going to be a lot more incentives for companies to transition their thinking of use water to replenish and make it more efficient.
Thanks so much. I think we need to move to our last little bit of our session here, which is really just to do a quick kind of round robin and ask all of the panelists kind of for their final remarks. What's the one thing that you hope that people can take away from our webinar today? Governor Lewis, can we start with you?
Yes, well, just to wrap up, the community, the Gila River community, we're moving forward and working to adapt to climate change. But what we're learning is we can't do this alone. And we need many partners and coordination, but this has to be done in a manner that's respectful. And so I can see the need specifically to consider some very fundamental changes to NEPA or other laws to accelerate and facilitate action. And at times the federal permitting process is cumbersome and works against change. But while we can be respectful of our federal partners and the processes that govern change, I think there can be, though, a friendly, respectful discussion to eliminate these barriers that hopefully will lead us to change, especially in these times. We're still in a pandemic. We're seeing a lot of discussion, especially from our younger generation as well, about climate change. And how do we engage that next generation? And I think we have a definite opportunity with when we talk about our federal partners, and especially with tribes again. With Madam Secretary Deb Haaland as the Secretary of Interior. I think we're definitely on the right track for some historic opportunities.
Thank you so much. Jeff, over to you. What's the one thing that you hope people take away from our conversation today?
That there's a role for everybody, that it's not, we've been talking a lot, and it's important to talk even more about inclusion and actively including people. And I think the important thing is there's a role for everybody. Not everybody's been very good in the past about making clear that there is a role for everybody and what that role could be. But if you don't perceive that there's a role for you, you need to agitate until your role is clear, I think, because as we've said throughout today, water is connected to almost everything. That President Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, used to say, we're going to do three things in climate change. We're going to have to adapt, mitigate, and suffer. And depending on how much we do in the first two cases will determine how much we have to do of the third. And so there's a role for everyone to help lower the amount of suffering that everyone will do. And if we can make room for everyone, there's a place for everybody to help make the first step in adaptation and then to keep it going. The other thing that we've all said here is that from the government, from the local government, from the private sector, there are roles not only for those people, but it takes all of those people to be able to move forward and to answer the kind of questions that we'll have to answer, not just one time in the next 20 years, but from now on.
Thanks, Jeff. Colby, what are your final thoughts on what you hope people take away from our conversation today?
Well, if you lived in Southern Nevada, I would say report water waste, change your irrigation clock, and remove non-functional turf. But since this is a little broader audience, I will end with that starting point that there is no easy button. So if for some reason you have an idea that is one thing needs to change and everything's going to be solved, you're wrong. There are no easy solutions. And I think you've heard that there's institutional changes that are needed, there's policy changes that are needed, there's shared understanding of risk that needs to be developed. And there's not one magic thing we can do to change this. So if you want to be a part of the solution, be prepared to roll your sleeves up and get to work. And my favorite quote in that regard is one that says, a lot of people miss out on opportunity because it's wearing overalls and looks like work. And I think that's true for adaptation as well.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Emily, your final remarks on what you hope people take away.
I think, co-investing in adaptation is going to be key. And I know for so long, and Lester mentioned this in his opening remarks, that folks were afraid to even talk about adaptation several years ago because that would take focus away from mitigation. But now we're in this space where we are being forced to adapt. And so if we are able to collectively co-invest and really hold businesses accountable, and communities can do that, and investors can do that, hold them accountable to put investments into adaptation for water, for energy, for the systems approach to make sure that we do have a sustainable and resilient future. And I think, really leveraging the remarks that Governor Lewis mentioned in terms of really harnessing that traditional knowledge that Indigenous communities and underserved communities bring to the table, they have been forced to adapt and to be resilient in trying times. And we have so much to learn from them. So absolutely bring them to the table, give them a seat at the table, help them co-design what their role can be, so that everyone is collectively addressing this issue together.
Thanks so much, Emily. Lester, you kicked us off this evening. Can you wrap things up for us with some final remarks on what you hope people take away?
Well, I'm going to be brief because I thought those were great comments that have already been made. So I'm just going to say we need to have a comprehensive multidisciplinary approach to this. These are not a series of one-offs. You need to look at the entire system and be able to adapt as we move forward. And we need money. We need to fund these things. But the reality of that funding is it gets to this issue of risk avoidance, risk and cost avoidance. So it's like, pay me now or pay me later. So we need to take some of that money we know we're going to spend in terms of disaster response and recovery. We're already doing that on wildfires as we speak, and move that into adaptation strategies that then reduce that future risk and reduce that future cost. It's all in front of us. We can get this done. We just need to stick with it and be mad as hell at politicians that don't want to help us get it done. I'll send you a list if we need that.
I'd like to thank the panelists today for this lively, rich, fruitful discussion. It really makes me hopeful to see such smart, dedicated people working on these issues and an audience that asks such compelling, kind of spot-on questions. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience for being here. Thank you to the AIR staff that made all of this possible, the Water Resources Research Center, the Udall Center, Kathy. I'd like to turn it over to Kathy for some final remarks.
I just want to thank all of you for being so brilliant and addressing the question that we asked so incredibly well. This is a really challenging topic, and obviously the answers involve, the government, the private sector, the economy, institutional change, societal change. All of these things are incredibly difficult to pull off. And, we don't have an adaptation czar in our world who can sort of make it so. So what that really means is those of us who are really paying attention need to make the contributions that get us past these barriers and get us to a place where the institutions are functioning and we're really able to manage the risk. With that, thank you all one more time. And I am incredibly grateful to all of you. I just want to point out we do have 3 more in our 6-item series next fall. We'll be talking about drought in the Colorado River Basin, which we suspect may be very timely in September. I'm talking about water and infrastructure, which we know is timely in October. And then biodiversity, water, and climate change in the Southwest, which is sort of one of my personal favorite topics. Anyway, we appreciate all of you who stuck with us to the very bitter end. Sorry to those we didn't answer the questions for, but I think many of your questions actually were touched on by the panelists. And with that, I will thank our staff one more time and check us out in a timely way. Thanks so much to everyone for joining us, and see you soon.